All right, good morning, everybody. So, as mentioned in last week's class, we finished the discourse. So, before jumping into a new discourse, which will not be next week and possibly not even the week after, keep an eye on the text. No one will start again. We're going to do open mic today. So, bring your existential questions, or could even have some boring ones if you like. We'll do our best to try to answer them. You might see it as a stump the rabbi morning. So the floor is open. Stanley, you could go first if you like. Go.
There's a concept that I talk about that's very fascinating. It has to do with Adam, the mystical interpretation of who Adam was, what our relationship is to Adam, what Adam's relationship is to God, and it involves reincarnation to some extent. And I'd like to know more about that concept, Adam, which I think was original or
Primordial, whatever that means. Okay, so the question is, what's up with Adam and Adam Kadmon? I think a lot of it is probably taken out of context, and has grown a beard and a kid along the way. The basic concept is like this. There's two basic ideas. The first is that Adam, the first human, was created by God's, as the Medrash says, Yitzir Kapav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He was formed by God's hands, whereas the rest of us are extensions of Adam. So you imagine the first mold was probably very, very spiritually high, considering that he also was placed in the Garden of Eden, the very beginning of time. So he was you might say a perfect human, but he was a human. The prophet tells us of when Yecheskel, Ezekiel, ascended to heaven, and we read in the prophets a lot of what we know about the heavenly works comes from the prophecy of Yecheskel, where he ascended to heaven and he reported back on what he encountered along the way. Like, for example, the praises of the angels, where they say, "Holy, holy, holy, blessed is God in his place." This all comes from that prophecy. In that prophecy, he says that he saw what was the image of a throne. So there's a lot of imagery. In Hebrew, it's dimyon, which can be translated as imagery or likeness. And he saw on the likeness of a throne, the likeness of a man. So what does it mean he saw the likeness of a man? God is not a man. But for that matter, he didn't hear angels speaking. He didn't see angels, because angels are spiritual beings. Humans don't see spiritual things. So what he experienced was a spiritual experience that, as I've used the analogy many times, when we look in a mirror, right, we see what appears to us to be a human, but it's not a human. But what we're seeing in the mirror is a piece of glass with some silver plating behind it that gives us the impression that we're looking at a human. But if you actually touch it, you're touching glass. You're not touching flesh and blood. So that's the best I can do in terms of what his experience was. He saw imagery that reflected a spiritual reality. The Zohar tells us that the positive commandments and the negative commandments correspond to the divine structure. And the divine structure is made up of 248 organs and 365 veins and arteries. So this is the primordial man. But in application, when we climb through the spiritual cosmos, we have layer upon layer, higher and higher, until we get to the highest layer, which is going to be ultimately God himself. But in the divine structure, we have the first notion of man, meaning the first notion of what will eventually translate down into the complexity of the human being. So maybe Adam is closest to that because he's the very beginning of that. He's that first reflection, that first manifestation. But beyond that, Adam is a human being like everybody else, possessing within himself the entirety of all humans to come, possessing within himself the totality of all souls, but he's still a human being. So, not giving you a fully satisfactory answer, but something.
Yeah, wrap that up. I read this off. Yeah, but the final quote is just Adam isn't only the first actor, but he's also the stage itself for the world. But he's more of the framework, and then he comes in.
Yeah, so we got to be careful with AI because AI hallucinates a lot. Yeah, so actually it tells us that Adam and Eve were created as one being, right? There's a misunderstanding that Eve was created from Adam's rib, and that's based on the Hebrew word selah, which can be translated as a rib, but Rashi, the foremost commentator on the Torah, tells us that selah is actually a side, and the Kabbalah tells us that Adam and Eve were created as two beings. In fact, in the text of the Torah, when it's wrapping up the story of creation, it says, Zachar and Nekeva bara oisam, male and female, he created them. So Adam and Eve were created as one being, and then separated from each other, which is to teach us a very powerful thing. Number one, that no human being, neither male nor female, can say, I'm a secondary creature, because male and female were created at the very beginning, and there was only one of us. So the whole world essentially rests on each and every individual, and every human being has within themselves all of the tools, the masculine and the feminine tools that are necessary in order to function and be present in this world. Say that again, I'm sorry.
Breathing souls into Adam, right? Does that mean they were split?
One being. He breathed into the one being, one soul. Two humans as one, combined into one. Now, that wasn't the long-term plan. That was a short-term plan in order for us to understand the role that we play. It's maybe this is overstated, but we call Adam man, but he's actually person. He's neither male nor female. He's just person. And the notion of male and female came into being when they were separated. Okay, good. Next topic, reincarnation. So there's a book called Reincarnation in Judaism, written by Rabbi Dov Ber Pinson, which I think is probably, for me, was the most comprehensive book on reincarnation. But the basic principle is like this, that every soul, so when there are 600,000 primary souls, when you take a diamond and you shine light through it, it has many facets. And even if those facets, those colors, so to speak, that come from that one diamond look differently, they're all a reflection of the same primary diamond. So a soul has many dimensions to it. On a basic level, every soul has 613 dimensions to it. So you do the math, 613 times 600,000. And then in Kabbalah, it says that each of those 613 have another 600,000. So there's a lot of dimensions to a soul. Now, a soul comes down to this earth to refine everything that's within its power. And because the soul has many dimensions to its power, the soul needs to come down as many times as necessary until it completes its mission of refining all of the soul powers that it possesses. Once the soul completes its mission, it no longer comes down again. Now, the confusion comes in because we like to think I'm preparing for our new JLI course, which will start in January. And the course is called Rabbinic Responsa. It's a very fascinating course. So one of the things that the responsa that this took place in the 18th century, there was a big fear, as it would be in a more sheltered world, that when people died, they possibly weren't dead. And there was a fear, probably an existential fear for all people, that you get buried alive. So I believe this was in Germany, where they established not the concept of a morgue, but these unique buildings where when you died, you had to be stored for 3 days before burial was allowed, because there was a fear that somebody wasn't dead, and then they get buried alive. According to rabbinic law, according to Torah law, there are ways that we can determine whether a person is dead or not. And as long as that criteria is met, we have no fear that the Torah is incorrect. And in this particular rabbinic responsa, there was a petition that was made to the government to allow Jews to be buried immediately upon death, as is the Jewish practice. And there were some other Jews at the time who were opposed to it because they bought into the fear. So the question was, this was the responsa: do we have to submit to this fear, or can we rely on the Torah's instruction of what's considered dead? And the particular rabbi, in his response, wrote that we have a Mishnah that tells us that on Shabbat you're not allowed to move things that have no function. What happens if a building collapses and there are people buried under the building? So you start from the top and you start pulling away. You're allowed to, on Shabbat, you're allowed to move these things because potentially saving life. So if you move the top stones and you see that the people there are dead, do you have to stop then? Or are you allowed to go further because maybe there are people further down that are still alive? So it says that you keep on moving, you keep on removing the stones, and if you find another body there, you see, you can uncover them until their nostrils. And if there's breath in their nostrils, to the idea that God blew into man the breath of life, if there's breath in their nostrils, then you're allowed to continue removing it. And if not, then not, because then we determine the person's dead. And based on that Mishnah, in other words, the Mishnah tells us that on Shabbat, if the person is not breathing through their nostrils, you're not allowed to continue moving the stones because the person's dead, and you have to wait till after Shabbat, and then you can remove the stones and bury the dead. On that basis, the determining factor whether somebody is alive or dead is if they're breathing, if there's breath in their nostrils. If they're not breathing, they're dead. You can put them away for 3 days or 3 years, they're not going to come back to life. And on that basis, the rabbis determined that this petition to the government to allow for Jews to be buried immediately upon death was correct. We did not have to lean into that fear. So why am I giving you that whole windy introduction? To tell us that just because people have a fear, just because people have their own preconceived notions, it doesn't make it true. There is a notion that, oh, I feel like I've lived before. Well, I'm glad for your feelings. That doesn't create a reality. That doesn't create a reality. So the reality, we have to turn to Torah to determine what is the reality. And the reality is that this is a little complex. The dimension of your soul that you are conscious of right now in this world, the dimension of the soul that you are conscious of has never manifested itself before. It doesn't mean that your soul hasn't been here before, but the dimensions of the soul that lived here before are no longer here. They're never coming back down again. In other words, whoever that person was that came before you, and by the way, everybody in this room, just want to throw things off for a second, everybody in this room, we may potentially possess the exact same soul. In other words, all of us may have, I mean, it's probably not the case, but in theory, we can all of us in this room can all possess one soul, but different facets of the soul. And I don't have any consciousness of you in my soul. And I surely don't have a consciousness of someone from a prior lifetime in my soul. So reincarnation is very real. It's a very fundamental thing. There's a very fascinating in the Haggadah on Passover, you have Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. The Haggadah tells us, quotes a Mishnah that says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, I am as if, I think it says I am as if I am 70 years old. I think it's 70, and I did not merit to recite the Shema at night. Yeah, did not merit to speak about the Exodus at night as a fulfillment of a commandment until I heard this opinion from Ben Zoma who said such and such. So not important for our conversation, that part of the story. The question is, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was 18 years old. And the Talmud tells a story that the leader of the Jewish people was, the leader of the high court of the Sanhedrin was removed for a variety of reasons. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was appointed as the new head of the court. He was only 18 years old. He was married at the time. And his wife said to him, what's going to be? You're this young guy. You're going to come in front of all of these senior rabbis. No one's going to give you the respect that you deserve. So he prayed to God, and that night he aged. So in the morning, he looked like he was 70 years old. So, and that's why he says, I am as if I'm 70 years old. So now let's understand the question. If I say, I am as if I've lived 200 years, and therefore I have, in theory, the knowledge of 200 years of wisdom, or 100 years. But I didn't actually live that long to actually have that knowledge. What's the novelty of what he's saying? He's only 18 years old. He's making the statement. It says, if I'm 70 years old and I didn't merit, you're not 70. You haven't lived 70 years old. You're only 18 years old. And the fact that you didn't yet hear this teaching is not such a novelty. If you were really 70 years old, it would make sense that you're posing this novelty. I'm 70 years old and I never heard this teaching, but you're only 18 years old. So Kabbalah tells us that the good of a prior lifetime is saturated into the soul, even as it's reincarnated. But that doesn't mean that we have knowledge of that. We have potential of that. We have the power of that, but we don't actually have the knowledge of that. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah had the inner potential of the wisdom that came before him of prior incarnations, but he didn't actually have it in a conscious way. But because he had that potential within him, he was able to say, it's as if I'm 70 and I haven't, the novelty is that I haven't yet heard this teaching. Anyway, all that to say that all of our souls, for the most part, are reincarnated, but we don't have knowledge of prior lifetimes. There are a handful of souls. They're called in Hebrew neshamot chadashot, new souls. And these are souls that never came down to earth. They come down to earth on rare occasion for a unique purpose. It says the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, on a particular birthday of his, he said that he sensed that in the next year a new soul was going to come down to earth, and he didn't know where it was going to come to. It turns out that when the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Leadi, of whom we've been studying his discourses, when he was born, the Baal Shem Tov said, I see that soul has arrived on this earth. It was exactly 1 year after the Baal Shem Tov, he was born on the Baal Shem Tov's birthday. So he sensed that there was this revelation that had come in. But that's a very unique circumstance where souls come down as original souls. For the most part, souls are reincarnated, and that's the reality of all of our souls.
The phrase, we never meet the same river twice, but it's kind of referring to that we're passing through a life is like, it's kind of space-time, but it's rare to see space-time bend just suddenly. But it's out there.
Yeah. Another question or the same topic? Okay, sure.
Experience a lot of suffering in this lifetime are repaying something they've done in past like reincarnation, and that's why they suffer so much. You know, when we ask like why do bad things happen to like good people? Why is an 8-year-old dying of cancer? Like horrible things that the mind can't comprehend why they're happening.
I don't think that's Jewish theology. Yeah. I don't, I've never heard that teaching. It's actually counter to basic Jewish theology. Like, why should one person have to suffer for something from another lifetime? Yeah.
I have a question
another question about like for example, in this whole washing of the hands. So I know in Kabbalah and Kabbalah and teachings that like you have like these negativity after you sleep. And so if I wash my hands, then my day is gonna be better, or it's less heavy, or is it like is it a whole nother purpose when you wash?
Yeah, though I would separate the two issues. So there's a notion, let me first explain what the issue is with the washing of the hands. So there's a principle that everything comes from God. So negativity has to nurture from holiness. That's the way it is. In other words, this is actually can sound very sophisticated. It's actually really simple. A sinful act, right? It has an energy. If we, God forbid, commit a sin or somebody else commits a sin, it has an energy. Let's say it's the act of stealing. So there's an act of stealing that is energized by what? What gives the act of stealing the energy? It's the person engaged in the action. So the person who's engaged in the action, right? We're trying to separate the person and the action, the person and the thing that they're doing from the little abstract, the action of stealing. The action of stealing has a life of its own. How does that happen? Because there's a person who's chosen to steal. The person who's alive is energized in the moment of the act of stealing. When we don't steal, so the act of stealing is dead. It's pretty simple, right? Any negative act has to be energized by someone or something engaged in the act. You have money in your pocket. I'm the thief, at least in theory. Well, as long as the money is in your pocket and they haven't stolen it, there's nothing bad in this environment. There's just money in your pocket and an idea that I have to maybe steal your money. But the money is just money, right? And I'm just a person. So there's nothing, there is no bad in the space right now, right? I can have a gun, I can have a knife, and I may want to kill someone, but that person's alive. The knife is just a knife. No negative act has been perpetrated. So now once the person steals or once the person kills the other person, the knife is still a knife. And the dead person is now dead. You're not going to say they're a bad person because they were the recipient of an act of murder. And the person who perpetrated the murder, the act has been done. So where's the bad here? The bad is in the act of murder, the act of stealing. When a person commits murder, by choosing to commit murder, they give the act of murder life. They give the act of stealing life. If they didn't steal, they didn't murder, then that act would be dead. It would never turn into anything. So the act needs to have an energy that's a divine energy to give it life. Now, God doesn't want us to murder or steal. So when we engage in things that we're not allowed to do, immoral acts, in the moment that we're engaged in that act, we are nurturing from holiness, even if it's something that God doesn't want us to do. That's part of the fair play that God created in the world, is that we all have free choice and we can choose whether we're going to do something that's immoral or not. When we sleep and our soul, for the most part, is out of our body, the body doesn't have the full energy of the soul there. So the body becomes available, so to speak, to those negative forces to nurture from. As soon as the soul comes back into the body, those negative forces need to leave because they can't coexist in the place of light and holiness. So they leave. They remain on the fingernails because the fingernails have very little life in them. That's why we can cut them and it doesn't hurt. And that's where they continue to nurture until According to Kabbalah, the only way to get rid of those negative forces is through pouring. So when we pour water, that's why we wash in the morning, the ritual washing, which washes off the negative energy from the fingertips. Once we've done that, now we are prepared spiritually to take on the day. It doesn't mean you're going to have a positive day. That's very much connected to your own emotion, your own commitment, your own spiritual practice. But it definitely, when you hang out in an environment, a negative environment, you're more susceptible to adopting the negativity of an environment. If you have impurity on your hands, you are more susceptible, not because emotionally you are susceptible to the impurity there, but because spiritually you still have a negativity in your environment, which is why in general we should have positive environments. We have a mezuzah on our door, hang around with positive people. It makes it easier to be positive, it makes it easier to be lighter. But it's not that just because you wash your hands, so therefore, everything's going to be great, or conversely, that if you didn't wash your hands, and therefore everything's going to be awful. You're priming yourself to have potentially a better outcome.
Blessing says,
so it's a rabbinic commandment. Washing of our hands is a rabbinic commandment, but it's based on, everything stems from the Torah's instruction that we should be holy, we should be sanctified, we should live higher, live more connected with God. Okay, let's shift over here. Questions on this side?
I would up to more of the modern age, speaking of unclean things and the idea of taking someone's money. I mean, there's kind of this popular idea that money is just a cult. It's sort of false stuff, right? So that with the cultural overlay of all this social media, internet, it's like an alternate world that we're immersed in. Do you have any guidance or anything on that?
Yeah,
Following the missions.
100%. So the premise is the same thing I said before. There's nothing bad about God's world. There's a passage in our sages say, "Ein ra yered milamayla," no bad comes from above. Really, if you think about it, there is no bad in the world. There's nothing inherently bad in the world. There are things that engaging with them creates bad. And there are things that are very difficult to create transformation. But money is just a neutral thing, right? What are the three challenges that we generally encounter in society? Or you might say, what are the biggest crimes are committed around power, sex, and money? Huh? Love, money, power. Thank you. Why these three things? Because they are very, very, they have a tremendous power to them. So, coffee is great. Definitely is. But it doesn't have the same power as money. Doesn't have the same power as sex, and it doesn't have the same power as power. Because these three things are so powerful, they can be misused. And they can create transformation in the world, right? If we look at world history, it's, power is what has caused so much destruction. Money is something that, by the way, power you don't have to be a president or a prime minister or a king in order to execute power. We each have power in some level within our own nuclear world, our own families, our own environments. And we can misuse that power and do bad things. So the point being is that all of these things are very neutral. The more it can be misused is an indication of how powerful it is. So we can use these things neutrally, we can use these things negatively, and we can use these things positively. And that's where choice lives. How are we going to utilize these things in our service of God and making the world a more godly and a more goodly place?
What did Torah say about cremation of the body when you die? Is that right to be cremated or you have to be burned? the whole body.
Yes, so the body is holy. The body is holy, and the body is holy because the body is the tool through which the soul is able to execute its mission on this earth. So, number one. Number two, the body doesn't belong to us. The body belongs to God. And the Torah tells us, from earth you come and to earth you shall return. So the Jewish practice is absolutely to preserve the body, great respect for the body, and that the body needs to be returned to the earth. And it also talks about the process of in the afterlife, the body needs to go through its own process until the soul reaches its final resting. So we are very careful to treat the body with great respect. We prepare the body for burial, and the body is returned to the earth.
What happens if you are flying? Explode and the airplane explodes.
Hopefully that doesn't happen. It's not on the agenda. But look, I mean, people have been burned alive, unfortunately, in the sanctification of God's name. That's, what happens when it happens is on God. Yeah,
You're glad.
I'm curious,
we're talking about choice.
Nobody can catch.
Yes.
curious about your view on demons and sort of that. So you got the story of Saul, who would have that evil spirit would torment him, beg for David to play, and sometimes it'd calm it down, sometimes he'd be overcome by it, so he'd throw the javelin, and David have to chuck a javelin a little bit, try not to get hit. Curious about like sort of your view of what those are, how that happens, is it oppression or is it full possession, and then what's some of the ways to get rid of it, and just that whole thing.
Okay, that's a really great question, very, very complex. So again, I'm gonna use the kind of what I shared before, is that we have a lot of fantasy around this because it sells. Doesn't make it substantive. So the first thing we have to establish is there's no competing power with God. So anything we experience is under control of God and is designed for us. It's designed to intensify the playing field, right? For us to be able to have free choice, we have to struggle between two things that are comparable. So if there are good forces, there has to be our impression of negative forces. But what those negative forces are really the absence of light. They're not independent energies. There are certain things, going back to the reincarnation, okay? I wasn't going there, but now we're going there. There's the concept of a dibuk. You ever hear of a dibuk? Anybody? So the word dibuk means to stick, to cleave. And there's an idea, and we have historical proof of this, that sometimes souls end up possessing bodies that are not theirs. And it's very painful. It's painful for the soul and it's painful for the body. Now, what happens is, the Talmud tells us about souls who don't find eternal rest. They've been banned from heaven because of certain behaviors on this earth, and until whatever time God sees fit, those souls don't find their rest. So where do those souls go? So sometimes those souls are reincarnated into other life forms, which is very painful for the soul. And oftentimes righteous individuals know where those souls are, and they help rectify what needs to be rectified so those souls could find their final resting place. There are historical events that transpired where souls who did not find their place in other life form went into human beings that already have a soul, which creates a terrible tension because there's supposed to be alignment between me and my soul. When another soul occupies the space, there's a misalignment, which is very painful. So what happens in those circumstances are what we call somebody is possessed, right? And when somebody is possessed, the soul needs to be extricated from there. And again, typically, there are stories, even modern day stories. I don't mean modern like in the last 10 years, but in the 70s and 60s in Israel, I know of one particular story that happened with the Rebbe, with somebody in Minnesota. where a soul entered into another body, and the soul needs to be removed from that body. And usually the souls follow the instructions when the right person is giving them instructions to leave. And typically, the soul is willing to leave on condition that whoever that person is giving the instruction is able to help that soul find its eternal rest. So back to the broader question: are there forces out there that God gives space for in order for there to be some tension? Yes. They're not independent forces, and they're specifically designed to challenge a given circumstance. So let's make this very practical. When Saul is throwing the instrument, it's fair to say that it's not unlike when I lose my patience. Would you say I'm possessed because I lose my patience, or that the devil's got me? No, I'm just not. I'm not aligned at that moment. Which is fair to say that when I'm not aligned at the moment, I'm giving power to a negative force within me. It doesn't mean that it's an independent negative force, a king of demons that I'm submitting to. It's a negative force within me that I'm not willing to conquer. I'm allowing darkness within myself to become the dominant. And I think that for me, that's the easiest way to kind of frame it.
Just real quick clarification, do you make a separation between like a fallen angel, demonic being, and then a soul who just hasn't found its way back home, or are they one and the same?
They're two different things, but we don't have in Judaism, the fallen angels are very, very specific events that the Torah tells us about. It's not a common occurrence. It's not something that's happening on a regular basis. It's biblical. There was a time where it happened. The Torah tells us about it. It's not something that we encounter. So you don't bump into someone and say, "Oh, you're a fallen angel." That doesn't happen. It happened back in the day. It was what it was. It's not a recurring event.
So the Gnostic stuff doesn't really apply to you. Sounds like
I don't know what that is.
that alternative cosmology, but it kind of aligns. But yeah, it's very much.
Yeah, that's the world of fantasy from a Jewish perspective.
Rabbi, I want to learn something about Hanukkah.
What do you want to learn?
What is in the tonight?
Tonight is the last night of Hanukkah, the 8th night of Hanukkah.
What do they do to the kids?
Huh?
What do they do for the kids? They give them a present.
Hanukkah presents is not a Jewish thing. That's something we adopted from the culture around us. The concept of Hanukkah, the traditions of Hanukkah mostly revolve around lighting of the menorah, eating oily foods, so you can start your diet January 1. And the other tradition is Hanukkah gelt, not the chocolate kind, but actually giving money. So there's a tradition, talk about your question about money. So money was a big factor in the Hanukkah story. The Greek Syrians stole from the temple the riches of the temple. And there's a practice to give money to children and to others to educate about money. Specifically to educate about money, that money is a neutral power that can be used for good or for bad, which is really the whole story of Hanukkah. The whole story of Hanukkah, the Greeks were great philosophers. They were great thinkers. They had a problem with God. They had a problem with something they couldn't understand, which is why we mentioned this last week, that all of the traditions that they prohibited, the observance of the new month, which is today, the circumcision, the observance of the Shabbos, the observance of kosher, are all commandments that are associated with a necessity to believe in something that you can't see, right? We're resting on the Shabbos because God rested on the Shabbos. There's an energy to time which you can't touch or see. Circumcision is a covenant that's beyond our comprehension, etc. So what we have is this notion that we live in a physical world that has all kinds of physical matter, and the purpose of that is to use it in the service of God. There is a notion in many religions, especially in Eastern religions, that to get close to the divine, you have to separate yourself from the physical reality. And that is totally counter, definitely, to Kabbalah and Hasidic philosophy, even if in many Jewish religious circles, there was a practice of asceticism. It's not true to form of Judaism. The circumstances throughout the ages didn't allow us to really fulfill this dimension of Jewish practice. Number one, we didn't have. Most of humanity didn't have. Humanity was very poor. There were very few who actually had. We also were not welcome in the environments that we lived. So we kind of kept ourselves separated from the rest of the world and did our thing. So we didn't have much to work with. We live in a different era. In the modern world, we live in a different era, different times, where every one of us can own a car and own a house and have a bank account and eat good 3 square meals a day and partake in the rest of the world. And you could be on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, and anything else you want is pretty much available. Our job is to recognize that we live in that world that makes itself available to us. And the gift of our time is that we actually can use all those things in the service of God. That's something that historically we did not have that ability until the modern era. I mean, the last 50, 100 years, but it wasn't something that was available, which if we look at, so to speak, that God is bringing the world to, this is the apex where to connect with God is the greatest way to connect with God is in the world and through the world. So the tradition of Hanukkah is to give money, to educate, that this tool, which is so powerful, to be used out in the service of God. Other questions in the back of the room? Yes.
I'd love to people do kind of all of that fun stuff. But to me, it's more of a triviality. Unless you're like facing something malevolent, then it's not a triviality. But in terms of the one person, and the idea of the different the word is Sephiroth, the 10,
The Sefirot, yeah.
the gender, the idea of being connected to the Sephiroth, and that it is far more complex than like bits and pieces of that list, but that it speaks to a lot of people who are difficult subjects or whatever, those people have their relations with things, but intersex people genuinely exist, and you have people who have different manifestations and different limitations to their gender identity and face. And I hesitate to even use the word gender identity, it's kind of that's attached to God, not necessarily manifestation. But those different, can you speak to the idea of how is it the idea that we're connected to this ontology thing, or is it perhaps there's one person at the beginning, and then you have kind of a separated out of those, like, how does that work?
Yeah, so I can't tell you exactly how the mechanism works. I prefer to look at that question from the human experience, right? So whether it's a male gender or female gender or a gender that's unclear, we each have to embrace what God has given us and use that to serve God. So in other words, it's for me to pretend that I'm a female. I'm not being disparaging. Like I know I'm a male and I have a masculine consciousness and so on. For me to adopt a feminine energy as my mission in life is counter to what God created me with. Now, conversely, if I was created a female and that was my gender, then I'd have to act from that vantage point. When people have a blending of genders or a non-gender, that's their unique circumstance that they have to live within this world and actualize themselves within that framework. So let's make the question not so loaded. If I have if I have a nurturing, a part of me is a more nurturing feminine side, and I'm paying attention to that, I may choose to embrace a career that is more nurturing. If I have a more masculine, hunting, aggressive nature, then I will act accordingly. I ought to embrace that role in the world. No different than we've spoken in the last couple of weeks. If I have a musical talent, right, I need to actualize that musical talent. God bless you. So gesund. If I have an artistic talent, I have to act on that. So each person has to kind of reflect on who they are and recognize that the complexity of each human being is by design. And that design is aligned with their mission on this earth. Now, exactly how that filters down from the Sefirot, if I was guessing, just like biologically, oftentimes if you'll biologically test male, female, you'll see the different types of chromosomes, right? You probably find some stronger chromosomes this way versus that way, which is ultimately going to be a reflection of the divine structure. It trickles down in some manner. I've never seen that written anywhere, but I haven't read everything either. So I would imagine that there's a divine energy that's some blend, with a more balanced of the two dimensions. Look, we also live in a world, for all of the nonsense that's in the world right now, which is a much more feminine world than it was historically. And that makes sense historically, because as we get closer to the era of the Mashiach, which is a feminine energy, you correctly said God is, on the one hand, non-binary, but he's also both masculine and feminine, right? Shabbos is a feminine energy. The Shekhinah is a feminine energy. We have God's names that are both masculine and feminine. So God has all dimensions to him, her. God has all dimensions, but we relate to God as we do in the consciousness of our world. The Messianic era is a feminine era. It's a feminine energy. It's actually called a day that's all Shabbos, and Shabbos is feminine, so the Messianic era is feminine. And we see the world is moving in that direction. So individuals may encounter, again, whatever God's plan is for each individual is beyond my pay grade, but each person needs to reflect for themselves where they fit in, what are their talents, what are their strengths, what is their complexity of their makeup, and act from that place.
We may have addressed this previously, but art and music often have like heartbreak associated with it. It's very common. From just in general in the community, you see that a lot. If someone has an artistic talent or a musical talent who kind of that season, just like gender, is there a need to revive that, to redeem that time to as a part of being who you are in your gender, in your talents, and like same idea? There's a need to pursue this, or do you?
Yes. So let's use the music, right? If you have a musical talent, you can create foul language rap, which does not serve creation, does not serve God, or you can create music that brings healing to people. I don't have a judgment about rap. I just have a judgment about foul language rap, and kind of stuff that when you're in the car with the kids and the next car is playing the stuff, you say, roll up those windows, right? That's not, rap is, there's a fellow in Israel who does rap. He's fantastic. He has all these chants that he does about the holidays and so on. I was actually watching one about Hanukkah last night. Every medium can be used for holiness or unholiness or neutral. And every medium carries an energy. I picked music and art, but there are endless talents that different people have. And we have to act on them in a holy way, in a way that serves God and serves creation. And when you are conscious, in the course that we just finished, the Kabbalah of meaning, one of the things that we discussed there is that when you get awareness about something within your purview, within your own experience, the fact that you have awareness around it is God's way of saying that this is for you to work with. In other words, if I don't have awareness about a talent, then it's meaningless to me. I may have it, but how am I supposed to know about something I don't know about, right? But once I know about it, then that's God's way of saying, hey, you've got this talent, you've got to use it in the service of God. When you have people who maybe, back to your original question, who maybe don't really think much about their gender, right? They just live. Okay, so then it's a non-issue for them. If they're thinking about it, let alone if they're struggling with it, that's God's way of saying, hey, you've got something to work with here that is necessary for you to fulfill your unique purpose on this earth. No, that's your pathway. That's your pathway to your mission on this earth. I mean, it's not exclusive, right? It's not that a musician, their whole purpose on this earth is to be a musician, but if it's a talent that they experience or an artistic talent, they ought to use it in some manner. It's very interesting. The Jews don't proselytize. Right? We're good with our community. We don't need to bring more people in. Everybody's welcome and so on, but it's not a Jewish mission to proselytize. Chabad doesn't either proselytize. In other words, we're not in the business of getting more Chabadniks, right? But there have been people over the era that have embraced Chabad philosophy and have chosen to adopt themselves as Chabad followers. And I'm specifically talking about people from other religious groups and even people from other Hasidic groups. When they would come to Chabad, the Rebbe would always, and you're familiar, we probably within the Hasidic world are the least pronounced in our garb, right? On a regular day, I would look like any other observant Jew, except for my beard, because many observant Jews shave. I don't have long, payos. I don't have long curls. I don't wear an up hat. I don't wear a fur hat. I wear a fedora. So my look is definitely not the average, but vis-a-vis other Hasidic groups, it's definitely much more neutral. Other Hasidic groups, even during the week, they have a certain garb. When these Hasidim would come to Chabad, the Rebbe would often instruct them to keep their garb. Don't abandon your garb to fit into the Chabad community, because the fact that you were born in a certain community and have a certain embrace of tradition, that's yours. So even if you're adopting some additional practices and additional traditions and embracing certain philosophies, but the core of who you are is by divine design. Don't abandon that. And I'm paralleling that to all of our experiences. Each of us have unique circumstances, unique talents, unique gifts. And if we are to fulfill our purpose on this earth, those that have come into our consciousness, into our awareness, we have to embrace and bring them with us into the service of God. Other questions? Something else, something on a different topic.
The soul is about, even Sambia, for example, the soul like
Ambien. Yeah, so I think we have to do a little dance here, okay? I'll introduce my comment with a story. On Saturday night, the Jewish practice is we make Havdalah. Havdalah is where we say a prayer over a cup of wine to create a separation between the Shabbos, the Shabbat, and the mundane of the week. And together with the Havdalah, we light a candle because we want to thank God for light. But during the week, you can have fire burning the whole week. On Shabbat, since we don't light fire, so it's the only time during the week where we can do an act of lighting fire, where we can then thank God for the gift of fire, of light. So that's one practice we do together with the Havdalah. And we also, Saturday night, we smell spices. The overall tradition is cloves. Some people smell like certain greenery, and we make a blessing, thanking God for for giving us this ability to smell these wonderful spices. And the idea behind it is that on Shabbat, our bodies get an additional soul, which is the extra soul of Shabbat. And when the soul leaves, so the weekday soul is a little lonely. So we want to kind of say, hey, here's a little pick me up. It's all going to be good. And we actually have certain songs we sing Saturday night, which is "Don't Be Afraid, Servant of Jacob." Shabbat will come again in 6 days. So one Saturday night, by the Rebbe's synagogue, they were making Havdalah, and the Rebbe didn't smell the spice. So as it would be, people start murmuring, why is the Rebbe, is it a special Saturday? Is what's going on? Like, what's the story? So they asked the Rebbe's secretary to find out what was going on. And the Rebbe said, no, it's very simple. I have a cold and I can't smell. So you can't make a blessing if you can't smell. The blessing is on the smell, right? So you can't make a blessing if you can't smell. In other words, not everything is a religious endeavor. What is insomnia? So insomnia could be anxiety, a misalignment, and it could be a medical deficiency. You need some certain vitamins. So what I'm saying is that I wouldn't paint with a broad stroke. Is that what you say? Wouldn't paint broad brush. I wouldn't paint with a broad brush to say that anybody with insomnia is dealing with a misalignment of soul. But I'm also not going to say that that can't be what it is. Look, what is anxiety, right? Anxiety can be a deeply problematic chemical imbalance. And anxiety could be that we're just misaligned in what we're doing on this earth. So you wake up in the middle of the night and you're starting to wonder, like, is this person after me? Is that person after me? How are things going to work out? And say, chill out, no one's after you. But if somebody say, just because you're not hearing voices, it doesn't mean that they're not there, or something like that. Thank you. Just say that again.
Just because you're paranoid doesn't.
Yeah, something like that, right? So just because you're anyway, the point is that when we're experiencing anxiety, it could very well be that we need to get ourselves anchored in, like, what am I doing on this earth? Like, what's my purpose? Why do I have so much fear around outcomes of financial outcomes, relationship outcomes? I've got to put the effort in to by the way, the people would ask the Rebbe about having a difficulty with sleeping, and the Rebbe would say to make sure they sleep with sometimes put a mezuzah under their pillow, make sure the mezuzahs are kosher, say the Shema before they go to sleep. But I would say ultimately, most of that has to do with anchoring ourselves. Where's our alignment? Now, it doesn't mean that a person may have some kind of chemical imbalance. They have some vitamin deficiency that they need to get the right vitamins so that things balance out. And I think it really kind of brings together a little bit of your question and some of what we've been talking about here is that, look, the reality is that the material world is just a concealment over a divine reality. And our job is to peel away the layers of the physical concealment to try to get deeper into what is the true divine reality in all of our experiences. But within that concealment, there are things that God put into the structure. In other words, when somebody, God forbid, has an illness, somebody is diagnosed with cancer, it may very well be that it's initiated from some kind of misalignment, but it still needs to be treated, with chemotherapy, God forbid. So each of us in our own life's journeys need to look at what's in front of us and look at it from multiple angles. We have to look at it from a medical standpoint. We have to look at it from an emotional standpoint, intellectual standpoint, and a spiritual standpoint, and not to discount one over the other because of that, because we find some tension in one area and say, okay, therefore that's all it is, and it doesn't have anything to do with anything else. So that's the balance that I think we all have to live within our lives. Anyway, for whatever that's worth. Yes, last question.
male and female, being created initially one, then separated from the female. Kind of implying that they are equal. What about some wood? I really don't know, that's different.
Sounds like you're about to step on a landmine, but go ahead. Go ahead. You're amongst friends here.
So, that talks about thanking God for creating me as a male.
You did stand on a landmine.
Yeah, but not a female.
Yes.
So
So what's the blessing? What are we thanking God for?
creating us.
Do you want to be a female?
No.
Why? Why not? No, don't answer the question. I'm gonna answer the question. So there are different roles that male and female have on this earth. And the proof of that is I cannot carry a baby. As much as I don't even want to. But as much as a male may choose to want to, you can't do that. Biologically, we are made up differently and we have different functions because we have a different purpose on this earth. Together with those unique roles, we have certain responsibilities and we're exempted from certain responsibilities. So women are exempted from positive commandments that are time-bound. Okay? Positive commandments that are time-bound. So for example, tefillin, right? Women are not obligated to put on tefillin because tefillin is a mitzvah that's only done during the day and only during the week, right? As opposed to making a blessing on food, which is not time-bound. Whenever you want to eat, that's when you make a blessing. As opposed to belief in one God, that's 24/7. As opposed to so what's the idea behind that? And there are many mitzvos that women are exempted. Many of them women are welcome to choose to observe, but they're not obligated. And the basis for that is because a woman has a different role in this world, and therefore God leaves time and space where her focus can be focused on those responsibilities. In that regard, there's a privilege that men have, that we have more commandments that we are able to fulfill. So you can say, you can either, the whole idea is to focus on the positive, right? I'm focusing on the positive that I'm not a female and I don't have the gifts that come with that, but I get different gifts on account of the fact that I'm a male, that I get to do more of these commandments. The reality is there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. And by the way, it's a good segue into another notion that that's very real today, and that is that the Jewish people have unique responsibility. It doesn't mean that anybody else is less than. It just means that we have a unique responsibility. And if we don't embrace what we have, because we are looking at the others that don't have that, and we feel if we feel elitist because of that, we got a problem because it misses the message. I think did I speak about this last Shabbos, last Sunday, maybe 2 weeks ago, where I think we spoke about it in the discourse, the idea that Jacob was humbled by the kindnesses that God gave him, right? That's when you're connected to God, you don't feel elitist by your responsibility, you feel humbled by your responsibility. So, and there's gratitude for that. And it doesn't discount everybody else's responsibility. Everybody should thank God for their responsibilities in this world. I'm thanking God for my responsibilities. Women should thank God for their responsibilities. I thank God for my gifts. Women should thank God for their gifts. Each of us have our own respective responsibilities. And unless we are all willing and ready to embrace who we are, back to the talents, right? Then we can't fulfill what we're supposed to be doing here. We've got to say, this is who I am. This is how God created me. This is the challenges and the gifts that God gave me. Now I'm ready to do what I got to do. And it's not a judgment of who's better or worse. It's got nothing to do with any of that. And anybody who goes there is not plugged into God. It's a misalignment in relationship with God and in consciousness. Okay, so again, next week there's no class. The week after, pay attention to the texts, and you'll know if there's a class. today at 4:30 on the Pond City Market Green. Enter from North Avenue. We have the final menorah lighting. It's been a very challenging Hanukkah, as we all know. So if you can, please come out. We want to bring a lot of light into the world and close out this holiday with joy, brightness, and warmth.
What time? 4:30?
4:30, yeah. There's more latkes and more donuts, in case you